Okay.
On a scale of 1 to 10, how weird is this looking thing over here? Okay, how weird though? Okay, 13. Wow.
And no, it's just like, yeah. I just like see your eyes. That's about it. There we go.
Big eye of public speaking. Okay, I don't know. You're apparently still assembling your PowerPoint. Apparently. That's gotta be a
Share. There we go.
well,
Do we want to maybe ask you to sit on this side or something?
oh. Can you do that?
Wait, I need it here.
Can we ask them to sit on this side of the room? So they can see us?
Because otherwise they're
Yes.
Well, or they also pull like chairs up the guns back here.
but I think we want, well, I mean, we can just pass the mic. Yeah. Whatever. Yeah.
Give them that agency.
Are we? Oh, there we
So
are.
I just had to make a new link, so if we can, I just tweeted it, if we can
Okay.
just
Oh.
repost it or retweet it.
I will not be tweeting it because I don't want my little.
Right.
Oh, right. Should we get like a? Yeah. You guys can't talk about.
Actually,
First rule of public musicology.
Yeah.
No talking about.
What's the Rochester rock AMS rock? What is it?
And that's.
rock, planet rock.
That's right. Oh
Yeah.
God, I can see myself. And here's a live stream of Amanda doing the thing. Wow, but anyway.
Okay, great. That's also one problem. Exactly one problem.
I also have a flash drive with me from some of the original pieces.
It's in Google Drive.
Did you put your shirts with us?
Not quite yet, but
Okay.
just,
They're gonna be here for the start, they're gonna be here for the start.
Right, that's true.
Well, bless it. Oh, did you use the hashtag?
no, not
I
yet.
did on my retreat.
Oh, there it is, okay.
Validate me. Yeah.
Like it's amazing.
Lovely.
We're pure class. Twitter wants to open YouTube. Yeah, it sure does. Oh, hi. I just wanted to say hi. Hi.
I'll be like,
Hi.
Are you staying there? No, I'm going to bed.
Go to bed.
I'm 13 wearing.
Oh, right, you're like in Europe and all fancy and whatnot. So, okay, I am planning to come to your thing on Sunday morning.
You don't
So.
have to. You don't have to.
You can.
Oh,
Look,
there's a
wave,
picture.
Kara. You're on the web now.
Dr. Kira Thurman, everybody.
Yeah, so you can watch us from your hotel room.
Okay, I went and I do that as I
Okay.
like slowly.
There you go.
I said, okay, so good.
Oh my God, I just watched myself sit down.
was gonna say a few things before we get started.
I don't know.
Oh my god,
It's gonna blow your mind. You're tweeting us? Right?
yeah,
Like tweeting questions.
Yes. I mean,
Can you just say the like first one of these?
trying to move the water away from like manual electronics essentially.
It's a very cool.
Step away from the table.
Step back. Just maybe on the internet
I don't know what.
Watch Will Gibbons pull
Yeah.
water from a pitcher.
or maybe trick. Anybody else like some money?
Thinking it's performance art.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Y'all didn't know what public musicology
Yeah.
was.
Awesome.
All right, shall we pull the show in room? Okay.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming on this first night. My name is Amanda Sewell. I am the chair of this panel on confronting the public in public musicology. We'll see how confrontational we get. But I want to welcome my fellow panelists, Will Gibbons, Allison Portnell-Lathrop, and Naomi Baratera. And instead of doing the bios, we'll let each person introduce themselves as they see fit at the front of their talk to give their musicology cred. So one of our goals for this panel is to look at some of the issues and consequences that are faced by musicologists when we're working with the public, as opposed to working in an academic setting in the classroom. So what information do we give, and in what amounts? How do we problematize things without actually using the word problematize? What info, what do people want to know? What do they think they want to know versus what we think they need to know? And some of the consequences that we may find in public musicology, less so in the classroom, financial consequences, things like that. So just a couple of notes. We are live on YouTube right now. Hello, YouTube. We have tweeted out the link if you would like to retweet that. We use the AMS hashtag, and then we use the public musicology hashtag as well. So if you want to tweet along, that's great if it helps you stay awake at this hour. And also, for those of you who are interested in more of the professional development angle of how we got these jobs and how you might find one of your own like this, although that's not the formal focus of the panel ends at 9:30, and we are happy to stay afterwards and discuss the professional development angle with anyone who's interested as well, job seekers. For now, we want to focus on the public musicology issues in the jobs that we do have, but we're happy to talk with you afterwards about that. Did I miss anything? Okay. All right, we're highly formal here. So the structure of the panel is each of the four of us will give about a 10-minute or so talk on what we do in some ways, some issues that we face in our public musicology roles. And then we'd like to dedicate the last half of the panel to open discussion and questions from you that can be directed to the whole panel or to us individually as far as the issues that we've brought up. Ready? Okay, Naomi's up first. Okay. I can turn up the mic too.
All right. Hi, hello everyone. I'm Naomi Baratera, and I am ABD / a PhD candidate in musicology at the Graduate Center CUNY, and I work at the Metropolitan Opera Guild in the Lectures and Community Engagement Department as a program development consultant. So my work at the Guild tends to fall into three main categories: developing programming ideas and strategies for our season of educational events, content development and in-person lecturing, and I work as the primary producer for the Metropolitan Opera Guild podcast. So this type of work I find is a balancing act of multiple objectives. As a musicologist, I aim to give my audience well-researched content that connects the works that we see on stage with the rich body of historical and cultural and analytical opera scholarship. As a teacher, I want to illuminate for my students and audiences multiple ways of connecting with a work. And because I work within a department whose event offerings are strongly tied to the fundraising and financial aspect of the organization, our business objective is always to be meeting certain budget targets. So essentially, we have to make money off of all of the educational events that we do. So with this confluence of objectives in mind, I'm here to offer my observations on two different types of programming that I've been directly involved in, the podcast and live lecturing, in an effort to illustrate what I've learned about what the public says that they want, or what I believe the public wants from the programming that I create. So while much of the work of the Guild is in support with the Metropolitan Opera Company, and a lot of what we do is closely paired with the season lineup, fostering opera appreciation at large and supporting kind of nationwide efforts for opera education is a big part of what the Guild does since its founding. And so in 2015, we launched the Metropolitan Opera Guild podcast in an effort to adapt a lot of the in-person lecturing that we do at Lincoln Center in different educational opportunities to a format that could reach beyond New York City, but did not cannibalize our in-person audience. And despite having next to no budget to work with, a production team that quickly shrunk from 2 people to 1.5, myself and a summer intern if I'm lucky, the podcast has remained free for listening audiences since its inception. And as of today, we have released 85 episodes. We've been running for about 2.5 seasons almost, and we are just shy of reaching 390,000 total listens to date. So the content itself is, as I said, directly linked to the Met Opera season, and it is a mixture of footage from our live events, but sometimes we don't have footage for a particular topic or opera that we want to cover, so we also create content from scratch specifically for the podcast medium. So I wanted to share one example of this. This season, the Met Opera Live in HD broadcast for Mozart's Zauberflöte was scheduled on October 14th, but we had no live event to draw content from for the podcast before the broadcast happened. We had already created a Magic Flute and Freemasonry episode last season, so we needed to create an episode that had a fresh, new perspective, a new concept, and so we began working on what I felt was a pedagogically interesting approach. We collaborated with the Met Opera Orchestra and explored Die Zauberflöte from the perspective of one instrument, the bassoon. Our principal bassoonist in the orchestra, William Short, was our guest, and he described the function of the bassoon at different moments in the score. He played several moments isolated, just solo, that we recorded, and then in production I dropped in the moment from the opera that he had just played from a live recording so that audiences could hear what Billy was describing and demonstrating in a solo atmosphere within the context of the whole orchestra. This type of episode was the first of its kind that we had ever done, and it proved to be extremely popular, with listening statistics higher than any other. It garnered over 1,500 listens in its first 24 hours of release, and now it has over 3,700 listens, and it's been less than a month. And so I think this episode stands as an example of the public's interest in insider or specialized knowledge that musicologists can often take for granted. As one audience member said to me, I learned so much from this episode. I loved it. It was so funny and entertaining. Billy had such a wonderful sense of humor. And as another comment that was shared with us on Facebook said, this episode was fascinating. In the future, I would love to hear something similar from the principal viola when you do Akhenaten. It would be an interesting perspective, as it is one of the few operatic works with no violins, and the viola leader will also be concertmaster. So operatic knowledge, I think, can be a type of social currency, whether it be a podcast episode or live lectures, and there is this desire for insider knowledge presented in an accessible way by a trusted source. My second set of observations is drawn from experience in giving live lectures. Examples from classes include pre-performance lectures, study days, and opera boot camp, within which we've covered many different topics over the years, from operatic voice types to exoticism to compositional styles, the lives of librettists, and soon in the spring we're going to do an introduction to the orchestra. So in my experiences, audiences tend to come to these types of events and programming, which tend to be on evenings and weekends, because they want to understand and appreciate the art form on a deeper level, but they really don't know where to start. The first time I ever did an opera boot camp class at the Cosmopolitan Club, which is a private ladies' club on the Upper East Side, I had the participants introduce themselves and share with the group what motivated them to sign up for opera boot camp. Many of them said their husbands had had subscriptions for years, and they go to the opera all the time, but they felt like outsiders. They never really enjoyed it, and they hoped that by learning more about it, it would increase their appreciation. Maybe they might actually like going to a performance, and they wouldn't feel stupid when talking to a lot of their friends. The class started with 15 participants, and now, over 5 years running, we often hit the cap that the room can hold at 60. Reading musicological books or journal articles can be intimidating for any person who is not confident in musical terminology. However, lecture audiences are often delighted and fascinated when I describe musicological debates, interpretive questions related to a source material, explain what a conductor's score is, share stories of manuscript discoveries, or introduce them to problematic elements that scholars discuss. After one lecture on Manon Lescaut, an audience member thanked me for encouraging them to read the story of Manon Lescaut in multiple ways. After a lecture I gave on Ingmar Bergman's film version of The Magic Flute, another audience member told me that the lecture transformed her perspective on the relationship between opera and film, specifically in her awareness of the camera's gaze and the power of the director in crafting an interpretation of the work. More recently, we had a study day titled Opera in the New Millennium, which was designed to introduce audiences to a variety of operatic works written and premiered post-year 2000 by a mix of male and female composers. It was a financial risk for our department because historically multi-session works on any contemporary opera have never sold well. But we believed it was important to give our audience the chance and the opportunity to explore opera as a living, breathing, evolving art form. The morning session was mostly a guided listening tour through different composers, and the afternoon we had a panel discussion of 3 composers, Missy Mazzoli, Kevin Putz, and Paolo Prestini, all of whom we introduced audiences to through listening in the morning. And in the end, the public was more than willing to take a chance on learning about contemporary opera, much more so than we gave them credit for. The study day nearly sold out, and we got some very positive reviews from those who attended. So as we all know, the opera world is full of fetishized nostalgia and very strong opinions, and audiences for our community engagement programming at the Guild are a strong mix of opera newcomers and die-hard fans. Several of my students have been attending performances at the Met longer than I've been alive, so when I choose to play Deanna Damrau as an example of something over Joan Sutherland, it is met with very, very strong opinions. And in some cases, there's nothing that I can say to convince a person to take a chance on seeing a modern opera or a modern-looking production, or convince them that opera doesn't necessarily have to sound pretty or beautiful to be a moving experience. My goal in the work that I do is not to force-feed every opera to every person until they love it unconditionally. I'm always very candid about the fact that we're not going to fall in love with every opera that we see or hear, and every opera might not be for you. But when you don't enjoy something, it is important to ask and understand why, instead of writing off a singer, a composer, or the art form completely. And more often than not, even when my audience disagrees with my assessment of a voice, a production, or a work, they still return wanting to learn more. So we spend a lot of time in our department trying to figure out what made a certain program or a certain podcast episode a success or not. And we have not yet found a foolproof recipe or formula. I wish we had. But I will end with 5 ingredients that I have found are consistently cited in feedback from our public as being reasons why they keep coming back to our programming. So in other words, 5 things that I believe the public wants from public musicology. So first of all, well-researched content that is presented in an extremely polished delivery. This means presenting a discussion that goes beyond what the audience member could read on Wikipedia and finding this perfect balance between not underestimating the ability of the audience member to understand a complex idea, but pulling out salient points from academic sources and finding the best way of conveying a select amount of information in a finite amount of time. And as a side note, when I say extremely polished delivery, I cannot emphasize how important this has been. When I first started working on the podcast, I was turning out episodes every single week, which is an extremely tight turnaround. We had next to no lead time in producing them, so we were working in a very rushed timeline, and for everyone who was excited about the podcast and gave us great reviews, we also had some negative feedback. One reviewer took myself to task for mispronouncing an aria name. Another reviewer said that the lecturer who we had recorded in a live situation was too far away from the microphone, and it led to a horrible experience. So setting a high bar in the quality that you're producing is very important. Genuine and infectious feeling enthusiasm from the lecturer. Edutainment really is a big part of what I do, and making opera fun for adults is hugely important in the success of a lot of our programming. This is a review from one of our lecture-going audience members who said, "My sense of fun was contagious." Thanks. Number 3, providing multiple ways into the art form. So drawing on what audiences might already know about art, literature, history, politics, so that they feel like there's a road into opera for them. It's not just for people who already know a lot about opera. Number 4, exploration as opposed to argument. So guiding an exploration of historical context, interpretive issues, differing opinions, gives the audience a set of tools to think critically about what they hear and see. And I find that it's often more inspiring for them than me working to prove one of my own interpretive theories or analyses. And then lastly, celebrating differences. So creating a place where sharing opinions and preferences are not wrong, they can be a positive part of exploring the art form. And yes, there are people who come that they want their own opinions affirmed, not challenged, but for the most part, people are willing to listen to a different perspective. They're looking for new things to appreciate and to expand their understanding. Because in the end, the exciting thing about opera is that there is so much to love and so many possible ways for it to touch each and every one of us in a different way. So that's my experiences with the Met Opera Guild, and I'm going to hand it off to Allison. Thank you. Oh, sorry, okay. But you want some kind of Oh, you took it. Okay. Right. Yes, do whatever you need.
See, the double laptop is a bit much. It's a little bit much. We'll just, nope. Yeah, if only I were super tall, it would all be accommodated in perfect way. I'll just be super loud. Hello everyone, thanks for bearing with me with the multiple laptop situation. Thank you to Yanni for the wonderful presentation and letting me use your laptop. So I'm Allison Portnow-Lathrop, and I am the Public Programs Manager at the Ackland Art Museum, which is the campus art museum at UNC Chapel Hill. And I started working there when I was finishing my graduate degree, just actually across the parking lot in UNC's musicology program, the music department. So today I'd like to talk about what the public wants from a musicologist in an art museum. And to start, I'm going to tell you what they get, at least from me at the Ackland as the Public Programs Manager and their resident musicologist, the only one I think they've ever known in that role. So I'd like to talk about 3 types of programming tonight, and I'll go through a little bit of what they are, and then for each I'll take you through my thought processes that I was having as I was putting things together of just how musicological are these programs. They are for sure for the public. The public is my sole audience. I work on programs apart from these musical ones for everyone from little kids doing hands-on art making programs to students coming to see our film programs. We have yoga in the galleries, all sorts of things. I will concentrate on music for all of you. But I think for me, part of this question is actually deciding how musicological these programs are. So I'll start with our first, I think most obviously musicological program, which is our Music in the Galleries concert series. As you could tell by its earnest title, it's our very serious, straight-ahead concert program. And I've got some token images of what goes on there. So for this program, I plan usually mini-series of about 2 to 4 concerts that connect with a particular exhibition that we have on view. Usually I bring out a certain historical time period featured in the exhibition, maybe a geographic center, and if possible, and this is the ideal, bring out some of the same themes that we have going on in the exhibition. So say if, I don't know, improvisation were part of the art making, then not only would I get improvisation from that certain time, or the certain time period and place, and try to make all of those things come together if possible. And we do perform literally right in the galleries, as you can see there, and I have a token musicologist, shout out to David Vanderham from UNC, featured at the center. One of our best examples of the Music in the Galleries series, I think, where I was able to hit on all of those points, getting the time, place, geography right, and the themes, was a concert series I put together in connection with an exhibition called Samat, where contemporary Indian art was featured, all very political, and part of the the point of the exhibition was to help describe how different art forms were not any more important than the other. It was trying to bring out all of these political stances where the religious beliefs were not being prioritized over one another, or different art forms were not prioritized over one another. It's sort of difficult to explain, I'm sure it's not. But for the concert series, we featured 3 different types of performances. So we had dancers in the galleries, and we're lucky to have some wonderful dancers right on UNC's campus that we could take advantage of and have perform right in the museum. We also had musicians from UNC and Duke, our sister university, except during basketball season, of course. And then some wonderful Sufi songs performed by some UNC professors that were working across the music department and the Asian Studies department. So we were able to highlight some contemporary performance practices to align with the exhibition on view, but we were also able to sort of cross the borders that were part of the theme of the show, with the best example being the UNC Duke collaboration, since we like to fight about them. So thinking about this, how musicological is our Music in the Gallery series? So for me, planning these concerts is always a balancing act. You start with your dream case, perfect scenario to go with a particular exhibition, but then you work with the realities of what you have. You have certain performers, a finite pool in your area. You have the repertoire that they already know or are willing to learn for the performance. And of course, you already have the money that you're able to offer them. And I've been trying to get as much as I can, of course, but there's always constraints there. And along with striking a balance of performing different musical genres, I also try to get a wide variety of performers throughout the year. And so in certain circumstances where we may be showing, like say, a lot of dead white guy artists, we can sort of remedy that, you might say, with the performers that we're able to bring in to highlight music in the galleries with those exhibitions. So it is, I think, potentially the most serious of our musical or musicological offerings, but because we're weighing the different realities of putting on these types of performances, it's not exactly it's not as if you can just press a button and get exactly what you would dream of having. So it is, I guess, fairly tied to history and culture as you would dream it to do with a particular exhibition, but you sort of get what you get in some cases. Of course, you get wonderful things that way, because when you work with real live human beings from your own surrounding community, they bring their particular strengths, their particular audiences, and it works out very well, obviously, but it's not exactly what you would pick up and play from a CD from the library. So, our second area, second musical offering at the museum, are our exhibition soundtracks. And I've tried this in a couple of ways recently, and I'll tell you briefly about this one because I got to put in a picture of Philip Glass. We had Philip Glass on campus at UNC for the Glass at 80 Festival, and so the museum put on a small exhibition, which you can see in the image on the left, for Philip Glass, featuring artists that knew Glass, and we luckily were able to get the real live human into the museum, taken by me sitting in the front row as eagerly as I could. And for that, I put together a soundtrack, a listening lounge, where I was able to feature works that related to the artworks on view at the museum, but weren't necessarily featured in this massive 8-day festival. So it was really nice to connect things. And I think Philip Glass might have walked by it. Can't say for sure that he stopped and listened to his own music. But that was the general idea. More in depth, we've had an exhibition called Genius and Grace of 18th century French drawings, and for that I got to put together a playlist that played constantly on loop in the galleries, a nice 3-hour rotating stretch of French Baroque music that tied into the exhibition itself. And for that curated soundtrack, we had wall labels to explain what it was, an iPad mounted on the side of the galleries that you could see what performances were being undertaken at that moment. And it was really interesting to make different connections. Of course, I tried to get 18th century French music, that's a given, but I was able, through research, to find not performances, that would be a time-traveling miracle, compositions by composers that worked in the same courts as the artists on view did. We were able to pull out different mythological works of music based on the same myths that the drawings on view featured. And of course, we got to find a nice hurdy-gurdy suite, because any good 18th century drawing show has an image of a hurdy-gurdy and everyone wants to know about it. So I put as much as I possibly could on that 3-hour soundtrack without getting the guards on my case, since they listened to that 3-hour loop for 3 months. But that, I think, was, I would say, a fairly musicological endeavor. It was well-researched, and it was a pretty extensive selection of pieces with the 3-hour block. I, of course, made it so that it wasn't so repetitive, and it had to be not so long that visitors could not ever get the opportunity to hear it all, but long enough that if they came back at different points during the exhibition, they would be treated to different types of sounds. And I also had to work around the constraint that it couldn't be so blaringly loud in the galleries that our other public programs that I'm in charge of, and also our educational tours with school groups and university groups, could get into the galleries and have their conversations, but also so that the general visitorship could actually hear it and take advantage of the soundtrack. Of course, I tried to turn all of those negatives into positives, and I got to employ as many different types of music as possible. So knowing that someone would be listening to it for 3 hours straight on repeat for 3 months, it helped me to think of a variety of musical styles, mix of different genres and keyboards and strings and hurdy-gurdies, so that people would get a nice experience. And I was really really conscious of trying to feature the best types and examples of the music you want to showcase. So just like you pick out the best recordings you can think of to share with the class, I made sure that it was top-notch stuff that we were sharing with our audiences. And so the soundtrack took this a great amount of research to achieve connection with the artworks. And in addition to being music from the same time and place, the artists worked in the same courts, and we're able to connect with subject matter, as I said. So I think that this is, 9 out of 10, 10 out of 10, pretty musicological. We got great feedback from visitors, and I think I've been encouraged to do similar projects, but the massive amount of research that it took to put it together has been the stumbling block for doing something on my side another time. The third type of musical offering, I guess, that I work on at the Ackland are putting together party playlists. And here I have just a token image of an exhibition reception. There's our membership and our chief curator hanging out. So for party playlists, I put together 2 to 3 hours of music, non-repeating playlists, usually on Spotify or something like that, that reflect a particular time period, place, or theme of the exhibition that's being celebrated, or 2 out of 3, 3 out of 3 if possible. We'll hear these at members' receptions like these, public celebrations of particular shows, or fancy fundraising cocktail parties. And even without the pressure to ground these lists in too much heavy historical context, I usually do end up putting a few days' worth of research and searching for songs, and recognizing the best song order and all of those great things that one does for putting together an excellent playlist. So just for a few examples, we had a recent cocktail party called Artini, that was connected to our Color Across Asia exhibition, which features a chromatic installation of art from Asia, mostly ceramics, in the exhibition galleries. And so for that, I put together 3 hours of music arranged from white into red, into orange, into yellow, and all the way through, so that by the very end of the very last cocktail chord, you get to purple and then fade to black. Which is an enormous amount of work for folks that are just there to get their $15 cocktails. So getting towards the how musicological is it? In terms of research, varied, but I think I found myself asking, is John Cusack's character in High Fidelity a musicologist? No. Putting together an excellent soundtrack isn't exactly, an excellent playlist isn't exactly that musicological. Then again, I put in hours and hours of work, so it should count for something. So with these 3 types of offerings, like I said, I found myself trying to assess how musicological they were. They're definitely public. So thinking things like, on a scale of 1 to 10, is it well-researched? Is the historical or cultural context shared in the program? How explicitly is it shared? But also, is the public paying attention? Are the spaces and activities in which the music is heard even suggesting that they should be paying attention? And if it were suggested, would they even want to? And then I wondered if another factor should be included in this question. Are folks actually enjoying themselves? Are they having fun? I was having fun, obviously. But is the audience having fun? And so it occurred to me when I was thinking about this fun question as part of is it musicological, that I think what the public wants from musical programs at the museum is what the public wants from any museum experience, which is to have fun. We can read NEA reports, we can read the recent culture track surveys, and we know that people go to these arts destinations to have a good time, and I'm so glad you said edutainment out loud, because I think that's at least part of what the Music in the Galleries program is doing, maybe not so much the soundtracks. So for me, I realized in ranking everything's level of musicologicalness, that I had to not only count whether it was well-researched and whether it tied in perfectly to the cultural context and how much I bothered to explain those contexts, but how it was interacting with visitors at the level and in the way that they wanted. And for us at the museum, the way that they want to interact with art is through fun. So what the public wants from a public musicologist, I think, fun programs at the Adlin. So I'll leave it there and hand things over now to Will. Will Gibbons. I'm going to take all these laptops.
Good evening. My name is William Gibbons. I work at Texas Christian University in Fort Worth. And what should I say about myself here? I'm going to talk about it a little bit. I wrote a book on French opera culture, and then I have a new book on video games and classical music that's coming out very shortly. Now, since I mostly study video game music these days, I don't really think of myself as a hip musicologist. But much to my chagrin, I'm the most old-fashioned person on this panel. With some exceptions, my engagement with public musicology is pre-concert talks with orchestras and opera companies, and I contribute program notes to arts organizations maybe 7 or 8 times a year. I do this as a complement to my position as a tenured faculty member at a traditional university school of music, where I have a joint appointment as a college administrator. I want to acknowledge up front that my employment and how I tend to interact with the public puts me in a very safe position with regards to what we're talking about on this panel tonight. Now, in my short contribution to this panel, I'd like to start a conversation about ethical responsibility in public musicology. As a researcher and an educator, my first instincts are always to contextualize, problematize, and otherwise deconstruct our relationship to musical works. I'm never particularly concerned with encouraging people to like or appreciate any particular kinds of music, but I am deeply invested in ensuring that people think critically about music, what it means, and how they consume it. But is that what the public wants from public musicology? What, if any, ethical responsibility do we bear when we engage with the public as musicologists? And if we have any, what should we do when those responsibilities come into conflict with the goals of the arts organizations that are paying us to provide edutainment? Let me offer an example. Like many people, last year I found myself dispirited by US politics and questioning many of my long-held and apparently naive beliefs about American culture. In late October, I got a request from a professional orchestra with which I have a long-standing and mutually beneficial relationship. Or, I should say, I hope it's mutually beneficial. I definitely benefit. The orchestra rep, not my normal contact in this case, asked me to write a brief, upbeat history of the Viennese New Year's Eve concert tradition for the orchestra's December 31st concert. The program was full of the usual festive fare, frothy Strauss waltzes that encourage the elegant audiences to leave nasty politics behind. Of course, morale raising isn't a new function of Viennese-style New Year's Eve concerts. That was also the plan when they began in 1939, with support for the director of the Hitler Youth as a form of war relief for exhausted Nazi soldiers. You can imagine my concern at being asked to write a set of feel-good notes on that particular history. When I reached out about the problem, I got exactly the kind of horrified reaction you'd expect, along with the suggestion that I should, and here I'm paraphrasing, just leave out the Nazi bit. I found that solution unacceptable. So what to do? I could pass on writing this set of notes and let the orchestra find someone else, but doing so might strain my relationship with this organization and would remove the benefits I personally get from this sort of public presentation. On the other hand, I could write the notes exactly as requested, but in the process, commit what I would consider to be an unethical lie of omission. Ultimately, I found an uneasy compromise with which I'm still not entirely satisfied. In hopes of educating the audience without ruining the festive mood, I wrote notes that alluded to wartime origins in 1939 and morale boosting for enemy troops or weary troops. And I suggested that sometimes traditions come from the worst of circumstances and can still have some value. Now, my example here is a small, isolated incident, but the question it raises are much larger. I don't mean to sound cynical, but by and large, I've found that what classical music audiences often want from public musicology is to be told how great classical music is, and by extension, how great they are for appreciating and supporting it. That can create friction between arts organization and audiences on the one side, and on the other, public musicologists who hope to encourage critical evaluation of musical traditions. Does being a public musicologist mean that, like a good classroom instructor, I should challenge my audience even if they don't necessarily want to be challenged? If so, how much is too much? How much can I talk about issues of representation with an audience who just shelled out $100 for a ticket to Madame Butterfly or Otello? How much should I use my training and my platform to argue with donors when they say women can't conduct or that pop music is garbage? In short, do we need a musicological code of ethics in how we use our training and knowledge to engage with the public? Thank you.
Oh. That's my wallpaper. Display settings. Okay, no more giraffe. Like my giraffe afterwards. Hi everybody, for those of you who came in after we started, I'm the last of the four to present, and then we'll open up for questions and discussion afterwards from all of you, so I hope you're ready. I'm Amanda Sewell, and what's my bio? I have a PhD from Indiana. I've published on sample-based hip-hop and nerdcore hip-hop, and I'm a classical music host at Interlochen Public Radio. Classical IPR is one of fewer than 50 stations in the country that plays classical music 24/7. As a matter of fact, one of the few others is actually just down the street here at WXXI in Rochester. I host the afternoon classical music program on weekdays, and I also host a call-in request show on Saturday mornings. And like Allison and Naomi, I am the only musicologist where I work. And people who know what a musicologist is, they're usually pretty excited to find out that I am one, which was really hard for me to comprehend at first because I came from a huge graduate program. I was surrounded by other musicologists. I had spent a year in a really competitive job market. I guess that's redundant, isn't it? A really competitive job market. And it kind of makes it seem that musicologists are everywhere. But it turns out that actually finding one of us in the wild is pretty exciting and unusual for some people. I was like this rare zoo animal that people, it's pretty cool. So the listeners have a lot of respect for my knowledge. And it's really rewarding and exciting to have a place where my knowledge is so respected and welcome. In fact, one listener tweets about me pretty regularly, imploring their listeners to listen to my program precisely because I have a PhD in musicology. And on a note of discretion, not that anyone's taking photos of the slides, but apart from this one, the rest of the slides I'll show, I would prefer to not have the specifics of those tweeted or divulged, if you would do me that favor. So yeah, one of these is from a couple months ago, and one's just from this last Saturday. And I can assure you that when I was teaching, none of my students ever really celebrated my degree and my knowledge quite like this one does. So there's a lot of directions I could go with my work at the station, but today I want to focus on taste and taste making, specifically as those concepts relate to financial support. So during the Music by Request program on Saturdays, listeners occasionally critique the taste level of other listeners' selections. So for context, let me show you an excerpt of an average Saturday on the Music by Request program to give you an idea of the variety of selections that are requested. And I'm sorry if the print is small. If you have a smartphone, you can go to interlochenpublicradio.org, and I have them archived there as well. So the show airs from 9 to 1 Eastern. You should listen, it's really fun. And phone lines open at 8:30. Listeners can call or email or Facebook their requests. I play them in the order that they're made. I don't edit unless there's... my discretion is usually choosing a movement. If they request a whole concerto, there's usually room for one movement. On an average Saturday, I'll play between 25 and 30 requests in 4 hours. As Christmas time approaches and the pieces are shorter, the numbers will be higher. Ho, ho, ho. But and this is a very, very typical Saturday that I'm showing you here. We have, we have Schumann, we have Richard Rogers, Robert Schumann, I should say. We have Mozart, we have Wagner, but then we have Howard Hansen, who of course is a celebrity around here, but also at Interlochen. Howard Hansen is very celebrated. He spent his academic year here, actually, in his summers at Interlochen. But then we have pretty specialized, the final trio from Ernani of Verdi. That's a pretty specialized knowledge. The Scheherazade Point 2. We really run the gamut, and we have a lot of wind band devotees. So music for Frederick Fennell, of course, also a local guy, but spent his summers at Interlochen for many years. So there's actually a whole other paper to be written there. But of course, we have John Williams. We have music from Oh Brother Where Art Thou, The Sweetheart of Sigma Chi, etc., etc. Now I want to share an excerpt of an email a listener sent on this Saturday in the middle of the program. And I should mention, all the emails I'm sharing are part of our public inspection file, but I've removed the names, genders, identifying information, just for purposes of this presentation. So I came during that show, quote, "What has happened to music by request? You're going schlocky. I thought you were classical radio. You are my sunshine, sweetheart of Sigma Chi, way too much Star Wars. I was tempted to ask you to play Stand By Your Man by Tammy Wynette, or perhaps I'm Proud to Be an Okie from Musicology by Mel Haggard, or how about some Willie Nelson, or how about some Fresh Garbage by Spirit, or maybe the Bee Gees. What is happening? I'm turning your Saturday show off a lot lately. Did you filter requests before, or did I somehow miss the inane music requested?" So those of you working on taste making, if you need an ethnographic context, hi, I have a show for you. So to this listener, a barbershop quartet is equivalent to Merle Haggard in terms of taste level. And it's clear that this listener sees an impenetrable wall around classical music that should not be violated. And the listener seems to imply that we, or I, should be the gatekeepers of taste. And I've shirked my duty protecting that wall and allowed in interlopers like John Williams. So these perspectives on taste making and gatekeeping are not limited to the request show. Other times listeners critique the music that's played by the regular weekday hosts. So this is an email that I got. As a matter of fact, the same day. That was a bad day. Amanda Sewell drives me nuts with her self-indulgence playing a dog's dinner of folk, popular, but largely sacred music. Not Bach or some other classical composers who wrote masterpieces, but straight hymns and folk hymns. Her peculiar choices are ruining my afternoon, and I have been buying more CDs than I can afford to fill the working day. I leave you with this: you can never go wrong with the Baroque composers. Public inspection now. This lister pretty regularly chastises my programming selections during the week. They typically find my selections alternately too religious or too whimsical, depending on the day. So, they have literally written in and said that they despise all my whimsy. So what is at stake in terms... what is at stake, though, in terms of taste-making and financial support? With a public radio station, there seem to be two major possible consequences. One is that listeners withdraw their financial support, which can be a serious issue, especially since over half of our budget comes from listener contributions. And number two is that they turn off the radio. So let me talk about each of those a little bit. So here is an email of the type that we sometimes get with regard to the connection between financial support and content. Here the listener's kind of implying that the programming should accord entirely with their own tastes, but they do concede we could maybe play their less favorite kind of music like once a week. So, quote, I love most of your programming. My spouse and I give a lot of money to IPR, particularly when many other causes cry for our attention and we only have so much. You threw away a lot of terrific classical programming when you put on all that. We have a show dedicated to a particular genre. I liked you guys because you once played music intense enough to get into. Your programming is really important to me. Luckily, I have a decent collection of music, but I would rather, most of the time, listen to you. Maybe you could just have that genre on once during the week, and classical and contemporary music on more. Thanks. So, they're saying, yeah, we give you a lot, so we'd like you to do this for us. And then other times, the listeners will combine their critiques of other people's tastes, back to the context of the request show here, with their financial support, as you can see in this email. And here they're responding to the piece Mad Rush by Philip Glass. I didn't realize we were going to have a sub-Philip Glass panel tonight, but there you go. But he's quite a polarizing figure, actually, at least to our listenership. And Mad Rush, it's a piano piece about 14 minutes in length. It's a favorite among many of our requesters, but then it also, as you can see here, it's a least favorite of some others. Here they said, quote, "We just listened and listened and listened to Philip Glass's Mad Rush. I believe we timed it to be a little over 14 minutes long." They're correct, it is 14 minutes long. "It is by far the longest, most redundant piece of music you play. Do you ever consider playing just a portion of the piece?" From longtime listeners and donors. In this case, the listeners are less explicit about the connection between their support and the program content than the previous email was. But here, they're flagging themselves in the signature as longtime supporters, as if to let us know that they are people to be taken seriously. So in terms of listeners who imply that their financial support is contingent on certain content, I have the full backing of management and of development to politely ignore or sidestep anyone who threatens to pull their financial support because I did or didn't play something. No single person can dictate what's heard on air, regardless of their financial contribution. And if listeners don't like the answer that I'm giving them about the relationship between their financial support and the music that's played, they're welcome to take those issues up with our executive director or our director of development. In the case of this email from the longtime supporters asking if I ever considered playing just a portion of the Philip Glass piece, I simply replied to the question they had actually asked. And I said, no, we don't typically play excerpts from single movement works. But it's something we could discuss. Thank you for your feedback. You know, it's like you wouldn't play just part of Bolero. Although some people might have the same reaction in the context of Philip Glass. Now that I think about it, that was a bad example. Anecdotally, I found that the people who threaten to pull their support actually don't even give in the first place. And frankly, those who give at the level where the loss of their gift might make a substantial negative impact, they're not going to be taking their issues to me. I'm the host. They're going to be taking them straight to the executive director or to the director of leadership giving. Leadership giving is code for giant dollars, multiple commas in the amounts. In fact, just recently a major donor, complained to the executive director of the station in just this way. This person had donated some music to the station, and they felt that the albums they donated should be getting more airplay than they were. And so the executive director asked me to gather data about how often that music was played. But ultimately, he was the one who had the conversation with the donor about the fact that their donated music was being played at the same rate as any other music in our library and would continue to be played at that rate. I have yet to have a higher up come to me and tell me to change my programming on the basis of anything a donor has said. In terms of my second point about people turning off the radio, I'm sure some people do, but then they turn it back on again later. Music by Request is our station's most popular program, bar none. When listeners complain that the music on Saturday is too popular or too weird, I usually just remind them gently that we go places on Saturday morning where we don't go the rest of the week. And by and large, that's something the listeners value about the Request show. On an average Tuesday afternoon, you're probably not going to hear Harrison Birtwistle, or Miss Saigon, or The Abduction of Figaro. Saturday morning set aside for these types of pieces. And then I should mention that the person who sent the Merle Haggard email and the one who called my playlist The Dog's Dinner, they each contact the station every few weeks to complain about the content. And their complaints are always tied to recent content. So that means they're continuing to listen despite all the problems that they claim to have with us. This is not to say that comments about content should be ignored. But my organization is very clear about what financial support does and does not enable. So for the record, our decisions about programming are made with a combination of feedback from anonymous listener surveys, focus group discussions, listener feedback that's aggregated over time but without regard to giving, and cost analysis. We recently dropped a syndicated program from our schedule that listeners received pretty lukewarmly in the surveys, but it was one of the most expensive shows that we carried, so it just wasn't cost effective to keep carrying it. If a listener raises a serious concern about content, regardless of their financial contribution, our staff reviews it together. So much of our staff meeting after the dog's dinner email about my playlist, we spent that looking over my playlist from that day. We compared it to my playlist from other days and to the other hosts' playlists, and we discussed whether the listeners' comments had merit. In closing, I do want to say that the critical and vaguely threatening emails of the type that I've shared today are a tiny minority of the kind of feedback that both I and we get at the station. So both for my own self-preservation and for you, I want to show you some email comments that are far more representative of our listeners and their feedback. So the first one I played, Vesti la Juba, and the listener emailed me that old Rice Krispies treat back from the, no more Rice Krispies, like that one. And it's like, oh, you played the wrong one, haha, like, oh, you probably don't remember this commercial, so that was fun. Another one thanking me for the Kyrie from the B minor Mass. Hey, maybe more tomorrow. And then, for those of you in the back, I'll read this one with a straight face. Quote, I have not been able to buy a clock radio that brings in IPR consistently. It gives me lots of static. Do you have a clock radio you can recommend? Or do you recommend a store and or a salesman that can successfully help you with this? On that note, we would like to, microphone, hi. I talk into a microphone for a living, I should remember to stick in front of it, but we would like to invite your questions and comments and feedback, if you would come to the microphone to ask, and we'll awkwardly pass around our microphone up here. Can you introduce yourself? Can you at least say your name when you ask a question? Sometimes it's nice to know who the heck you are. It's very helpful. Or we can ask each other questions.
I'll start with a question. My name is Jacques Dupuy. I'm actually on the public musicology committee for the student reps. This was actually really enlightening and interesting. I think I'll bring some of these things tomorrow, the student rep meeting. But you've all brought up a lot of interesting things about challenges that you've experienced, sort of difficult things to deal with as a musicologist outside of an academic setting.
Oh my God, I didn't turn the mic on. I'm sorry.
Oh. Okay. Well, okay.
I'm off the clock.
Will, you talked a little bit about sort of a mutual relationship that you have with the orchestra that you do talks with. I wonder if you or any of the four of you could talk a little bit about ways that engaging with the public has helped you grow as musicologists, or has changed your perspective on maybe research that you do or the way that you do research, things like that.
Thanks, that's great. So I mean, there are multiple ways of benefit. I mean, one of them, I hate to seem mercenary about it, is the financial benefit that comes out of it. I mean, it's great to be paid to talk. My students are always shocked that people will pay me to speak. Well, I mean, yes, they're paying me, I guess. And their parents are paying me to speak. But no, I think it actually does impact the way that I approach topics sometimes. I just gave a talk. A lot of my research is about classical music and video games, and so I do a lot of talks for video game concerts, actually. And I find that really fascinating. I often think I should get an IRB approval before I go to the concerts, because I get so much helpful material from concert goers that they just sort of volunteer their own experiences, and I find that really revelatory. I don't know if you all have similar experiences where that works for you.
Great question. I mean, for me, there are two things that really jump out at me as things that have pushed me to become a better musicologist in ways that have grown. One is becoming much better at researching and consuming research very quickly from operas and topics that I'm not necessarily a specialist in. I am not a Wagner scholar, but through my work, I have been forced to learn a lot about Wagnerian opera and Wagner scholarship. And so as a musicologist, I appreciate that kind of constant need to be learning and pushing myself outside of my comfort zone just because of the position I have. I can't always say, oh no, I don't do that, right? And so there's that aspect of constantly learning and growing in repertoires that I might have otherwise not explored. And then also, for me, learning how to better communicate as a teacher, as a pedagogue, is a big part of it, and having the kind of platform to experiment in a way, trying new technological things, trying a new visual component to explain a concept, and being forced to realize that, oh, the audience doesn't actually know what atonal means, or what tonalism versus atonalism means, or how do you explain serialism to somebody who doesn't read music and has no concept of the difference between, what tonality is in the first place versus atonality. So being forced to grow and learn and evolve in how I communicate as a teacher is a huge benefit, I think, to doing public musicology, because it forces you to work with people who cannot read music and are not musicologists or conservatory students. And I think too that I get an immense amount of feedback from the audience members, people who saw Maria Callas sing, or someone who saw a certain production and can tell me about, oh, this point that you made, you should look up this production because I saw it and it ties in with that. And so there's a lot of kind of nuggets that you can pick up of information that are really inspiring from people who are far more well-traveled in terms of, traveling the opera world, or people who have just been seeing it longer than I have. So I think my particular audience, most of them cannot read music, but they have the most amazing archival knowledge of the art form, and there's a lot that I can learn from that.
I would say for me, I echo a lot of what Naomi shared. I think we may have the biggest overlap here of the panelists, but for me, it's been a lot of writing. I write a lot of web posts and just short blurbs, and so again, learning how to communicate directly and journalistically. I really had to learn how to write journalistically, that it's okay to start a sentence with a conjunction and these kinds of things from a journalistic perspective. And so learning how to write in a sort of narrative way as opposed to in a sort of scholarly way, which is not to say one is better than the other, but it's actually been a real learning curve for me to write in a way that is comprehensible to a non-academic. And that, I have to unpack the things for people. For example, we feature a new classical release every week, and I write about it, and I try to balance those albums between like the latest from the super hot superstar and ones that have an interesting story to tell. I mean, not that Jonas Kaufmann doesn't have a story or whatever, but like, he's opera man candy, but hello, how many of his seats are unsold? So
None.
but yeah. But I have tried to pick things that also have an angle. And Laurie Strauss and her group had the Lucretia Borgia's Daughter album come out. For example, we featured that, so to tell the story of these nuns, and hey, one of them may have been Lucretia Borgia's daughter. So I try to limit myself, try to gotta hold back sometimes on the geeking out, but yeah, learning how to tailor the knowledge tailor the information for the knowledge that the public brings, I think has been a learning process. Because I think in academia, a lot of times we assume everyone else knows more than we do, at least I do. I always assume I'm the dumbest person in the room with the least knowledge. But that's not always the case, I don't think. No?
I have my own, full of myths. For me, it's something that I think is still a work in progress as far as teaching bringing something to myself to change my musicology. I think because of the art museum environment and what it brings, it's an environment where the highest level art history research is on display through visual means, and we do have, of course, excellently constructed wall texts and fabulous essays and blogs and public talks that I help plan, but that doesn't mean that everyone reads those texts or that everyone notices the ways that there's visual puns in the galleries and that sort of thing. So I think being a musicologist in that environment, I don't give a pre-concert talk at every concert that we give in the galleries. I might, put some words here or there to help people draw the connections themselves, or I wouldn't necessarily have extended wall labels in a listening lounge or in a exhibition space with a curated soundtrack because it's not appropriate to those spaces in a lot of times. So for me, I'm still figuring out a way, I think, to make the more obvious musicological endeavors obvious to the public that encounters them, so that it's not just 3-hour curated playlists that I know are excellent and that have been well researched, but that I can sort of pull the curtain back a little bit. But there's something weird, I think, at least to me, about the art museum environment where you don't expect visitors to, they don't expect to encounter the curtain pulled back on a lot of things as they come in on the art side. So I'm working on it, I think.
I should mention I'm not ignoring you. I'm checking our Twitter feed, but if anyone has keeping an eye on the Twitter feed and sees a question that comes up via social media, we're trying. but if anyone's got a spare eyeball to keep on it and wants to ask on behalf of someone, we'd be grateful for that as well. Thanks.
And I'm just going to jump in to tag on before our next question that another thing I think that is fantastic about working in public musicology is that you learn new skills that you might not have learned in a traditional musicological track. And so for me, when the opportunity came up to work on the podcast, there was no one else in the office who was confident enough to do it. And I had zero audio editing background or skills or training, but a part of me said, if I could learn that skill, this is a really good fit for my knowledge. So I said, oh, I can do that. I need to do some learning. I need to kind of put myself through a bit of a audio editing boot camp, but I'm confident I can learn how to do that. So, and I would not have voluntarily kind of pursued that if I were in a more traditional track, I think. So that's a benefit, public musicology, for students that are considering that kind of thing. You learn a lot that you never thought you would.
Hi, Susan.
Hi, Amanda. I'm Susan Key, and I guess I have time to respond to two of your presentations. First, Will, just a comment. I thought the example about the Hitler and the kind of ethical questions that this brings up was a really good one. I also thought that, in my experience, I think most audiences are very willing to be challenged. It doesn't mean that you're going to get up and ruin, New Year's Eve, to put the New Year's Eve in context. So I would encourage you to keep finding those uncomfortable compromises. And on the other end, I think there's a tendency in academia for us to communicate this kind of tired cynicism about the music, that, in other words, we're problematizing so much that it just becomes a real problem, everything. And if you love the music, I think it is perfectly all right to communicate enthusiasm about the music. And I think audiences respond to that. And it's one thing that we don't do often enough, I think, in an academic context, is say, oh, I really like that. There's nothing wrong with loving the music, no matter how much we problematize it in an academic context. And then I just had a couple questions for Allison. I love the sound exhibitions, the playlist, and I'm wondering, I'm actually working with some students, and we're curating, using our university's art collection, we're curating an exhibit and everybody's choosing music to go with the works of art, and we're thinking about a publication. So I was just wondering whether you had ever thought about memorializing some of this in a public or within a catalog format, and then, and I'm going to ask one more question and sit down and get the answer. Have you ever thought about working with maybe the master students to do some of that research? Because you were talking about how much research it takes and how that's one of the barriers to doing more of this. And I was just wondering, it seems like it would make a great master's project. So that's not.
Yes, I agree. I think I thought a lot about how our museum blog could be a good home for memorializing the curated playlists. I think because we, in a lot of cases, do have permission to publish the images online, and we, the world, have so much access to streaming music and easy ways to embed Spotify playlists in blogs, and our website's just WordPress, so it couldn't be easier. So that's one thing that I've been exploring. It would be amazing to make it into a catalog, and that would definitely make some parity with the art museum culture of, the way that you memorialize an exhibition. I guess you'd have to find a way, theoretically, to include sound, but that's something that all musicologists are struggling with perpetually, the written word and how to talk about sound and include sound. So that would be an interesting avenue. And I do like the idea of including our master's students across the parking lot, so I'll just have to start getting the professors convinced. I think that'd be excellent.
Yeah, thank you, Susan. I appreciated what you said, and I just wanted to respond back a little bit to a couple of those points. You make a really good point about audiences being willing to be challenged. And I often find that to be the case, and I think a lot of it depends on the setting and the way that things are built. So, for example, some work I do, for example, with an opera company, I usually am the person who does the contemporary opera, and people come in and they really are ready to face those questions. And then sometimes I do work with perhaps more traditional audience members. I'm thinking of the Sunday afternoon symphony concerts when the average age is dead. And they're wonderful people, but I think at that point, sometimes they don't want to be. They've been doing the exact same thing in the exact same way for 40 years, and they don't necessarily want to change at this point, which is fine. But the other thing I was going to say to what you said is I absolutely agree that we need to be able to communicate enthusiasm always. But on the flip side, something I think about more and more is that I feel like we also need it to be okay for us to communicate that we don't love every piece of music. Sometimes I think if we communicate universal enthusiasm, then people feel like there's something wrong with them if they don't like a piece of music. And I find this with students all the time. I'm on the internet and everything. I don't care for Brahms. And I feel like I said this once in class, and about half of my class said, "Oh my God, thank you." Because they've been going for years thinking that there's something wrong with them because they don't like Brahms, which maybe you agree that that's true. But yeah, I think we have to find ways to communicate that there are ways to intellectually engage with music, even if it's not your favorite piece of music. But I also agree, again, that enthusiasm is crucial. We can't just not have opinions or feelings about it.
If I can piggyback on that, on the Music by Request program, I hear from a lot of people that they don't love every piece that's requested, but they love the entire program. Like, they're interested to hear, and I try very hard to prepare in as much time that I have, before a request, but I get requests for Harrison Burke whistle or George Antheil, or, and which is awesome, but I try to prepare people a little bit for what they're about to hear when I do, but they're usually willing to go along with it, maybe because it's being chosen by a peer out there too, but then there's this Philip Glass piece that's too long situation. Please.
Yes, hi. I'm Jeff Daly, the president of the Greater New York chapter. And my question is for all of you. You've kind of been talking about preaching to the choir. Do you have any ideas about proselytizing?
To whom?
Well, you preach to the entire world, right? You want to get people to become either more interested in music or interested in music history, or I guess each of your audiences will be somewhat different, but again, it seems like most of you are dealing with people who physically come to things already musical, and so they have a pre-existent desire to be there. But is there ways in which you or your organizations are trying to attract people who do not fall into that category?
I can start with a very recent example. So I mentioned that almost everything we do in the Lectures and Community Engagement Department is a ticketed educational event, so people that come have to pay for it. So actually for the first time, just last week or 2 weeks ago, we had a free event, and we reached out to audience members that come all the time to our lectures and different programming, and we said, we want to personally invite you to this listening party that we're having, and please bring a friend who's never been to the opera or is always wondering why you're so crazy about it. Because we're just going to listen to some of our favorite excerpts and talk about what we like. And that was, we had no idea how this was going to go over, but that was a really interesting experiment, and people did bring their friends who had never been to the opera, who had never really been into classical music, and I think because it didn't cost them anything to do so, and you didn't have to know anything going into it, it was just, come listen to some opera with us, and we're going to talk about why we love this, why did we choose this piece or this singer. And so I think that's just one way of encouraging the actual audience to bring their friends and non-classical music people into it, that we think worked for us, and we hope to do something like it again. And I think that the idea of bringing a friend could go in interesting directions.
One thing that we are working on in northern Michigan is, at our station in particular, is community engagement on a number of different levels. It's an interesting area because there's not only Interlochen Center of the Arts, which is a thing, but there's a ton of community, semi-professional, amateur, and mixed level ensembles of all types, and then different. We have some small cities with, opera house-sized venues that bring in groups. So we work very much in connecting with those venues and the artists that they're bringing in. And we also do a lot of community engagement in that there are people who play in those orchestras or sing in those choirs who don't listen to us. And so we try to play their audio, we try to interview their soloists, we try to connect with them. And again, I'm not going to, a Kid Rock concert and maybe trying to bring in somebody from that way, but we do try to connect with people who are audience adjacent, I suppose. And we also, Northern Michigan is very spread out, and so we actually have direct competitors in terms of classical FM signals. In some areas, it's an enormous region. So we also have direct competition as far as we want them listening to us and not to the other people. So again, that's not bringing in the people with no classical experience, but it is trying to bring people to us and not necessarily to that. But as I said with our request show on Saturdays, we get a lot of listeners there who don't listen during the week. So we think a lot about how do we bring them in more regularly too. But that's an issue that we contend with.
So the reason we run public programs at the museum is because we're proselytizing for art. So we have music in the galleries and music playing so that we get people sucked in through music to go see the exhibition. So there is obviously a flip side to this. But as far as the concerts go in the galleries, I make a point, even if I don't give a musicological lecture at the beginning, to say, I hope that you'll take some time during this actual hour-long performance to get up and go experience the art while hearing this live music in the background, because we have a fairly small museum and you can do that even without amplification. So I invite the people who are already sitting down in a relatively stable concert setting to get up, go out, come back, and And I think other visitors see that and are encouraged to walk in halfway through, sit down with their kid, get up if their kid screams. And so we have all sorts of ways that people, it's a free museum with free entry, our programs are free. So on that side of things, we do actually, I think I build in a little bit of coming and going so that it encourages people to come in and take what they can from it.
And I'll say this is where I find my situation really interesting, because I do have a lot of ideas about ways they could improve the public outreach of the organizations, but that's not my job. I mean, that's someone's job there. And it's not that I mean that in terms of like I don't want to do it. I mean, the person whose job that is doesn't want me to do it. And so, you know, in a certain sense, I'm the hired help that just sort of, I just come in and I do my spiel and I park in the employee space for only an hour and then I leave and this is it. And so it's kind of it's actually a really tricky situation for me, because I always feel like I'm sitting on my hands a little bit when I say, oh, you know, they had this great program at the Met. You know, well, we're not the Met, are we? Yeah. And, you know, so I think it does sometimes put us in a bind in terms of how we can engage, because there are people who that's their job and they're doing a really great, you know, mostly a fantastic job at it. But I think those of us who aren't full-time public musicologists also have things to contribute or new ideas that maybe are worth exploring.
If I can give a very specific example in the context of this panel, Naomi was talking about the podcast, and I said, you have a podcast, is that available to be broadcast on the radio? Because if we were able to broadcast a, 1 hour crash course on that week's live Met broadcast, say Friday evenings, so our listeners could know what was going to happen the next day starting at 1 o'clock, I think that is something that would be extremely valuable. So I was like, let's talk. But neither of us is the person who does that thing, so we need to get the people who do those things to understand what we want to do and to share that and all of that. So stay tuned, but the sharing of ideas is very beneficial. So we might get people listening to the Met Opera, each week thanks to a podcast that, that kind of thing. So baby steps.
Hi. Okay. Hi, my name is Natai Perez. I have another question very similar about like the public musicology. So I'm really curious about this really problematic concept of classical music that a lot of you guys alluded to, where people sort of think it's really elitist, it's really high art, I am somehow better because I listen to it. And I'm wondering, as musicologists, what we can do beyond just trying to raise awareness of musicology, what we can do to sort of like, confront that issue, because we realize that it's a really antiquated issue in musicology now, which is really the irony. I don't know about you guys, but when I first told my family, hey, I'm being a musicologist, they're like, oh cool, so you're gonna go learn a lot about Beethoven, Bach, etc. When really, there's so much more to it.
Yeah, again, sort of a weird situation. I just don't, I intellectually understand, but I don't believe in classical music as a concept. I just don't think it's a concept that has merit. And so, it's tricky for me because sometimes, again, as I said, I feel like people often want to have their ideas reified about, this is a great thing that you're doing, and it's good that you spent $100 on this because it's making you a better human being, which is something I don't believe. If they like it, they should listen to it, and if they don't like it, they should listen to something else. And so it is sort of a tricky thing there because, this is music that I'm very frequently passionate about, and I'm happy to share about that with people, but I do think we're still dogged by this idea of classical music as good music in the sort of 1920s sense. And I don't know what to do about that in a certain sense, because a lot of arts organizations, I'm very passionate about those organizations too, but sometimes they're predicated on that idea. That classical music is constantly in a state of economic distress because, to an extent, we want it to be in a constant state of economic distress because that proves that it's exclusive and we're one of the few people who are the true believers, capital TV. And so, it's a tricky situation, I think, all around, and we could talk for another 7 hours about that, I feel like.
something that I encounter pretty frequently is that the audiences that come to things at the Guild or come to my lectures, come to Opera Boot Camp or at the Cause Club, they're fairly enamored with the fact that I'm young and that I'm a female and that I like opera and that I have knowledge about it. Like that whole combination of things, and especially like, oh, it's so nice to see a young person like coming to the opera and that type of thing. And so I think everyone in the industry is struggling to figure out how to break down those barriers, and and those kind of preconceptions that it's this elitist thing that's only for a certain group of people. But I think that lately I've been really thinking about the more diversity that we can get in people who are visibly a part of the industry, then the more it will truly appear and truly be that classical music is for everybody. And I think that's a really hard thing to do, and so I always say that I got this job by accident because I created it, and so like how do you then encourage somebody else who might not have the same tools that I had to create it, to get involved in the industry? It's a really hard question, but lately I've been fairly convinced that we need to find a way to have more diversity in what people see, the thing that the people who are representing it, the people who are presenting it, what their initial kind of first impression is of it will largely dictate whether or not they believe that it's a space they can enter into or not. And so I don't know how to fix it, but I'm pretty passionate about trying to find a way.
Would you like to have the last question? And then we'll wrap it up, but then we can talk more informally about the professional development angle of it as well.
Jonathan Waxman from Hofstra University. Something over the past week, the Hofstra Orchestra concert, from which I've written program notes for, often had their concert this weekend, and the orchestra conductor wrote the program notes, and he was having a very difficult time with, in far as how much information that he wanted to give the audience that may not know a lot about the pieces, may not know a lot about the composers, how much information he could do without being so reductive with it. So he wanted to make it well-researched and everything, but on the other hand, that he couldn't use certain phrases that would be common in music, because if he did, it might turn people off, they might not understand exactly to what he was referring. So I wanted to know how you guys managed to balance that in your work.
I can think of one incident where I can't remember if it was a weekday or if it was a request show, and I had played just this fabulous Schubert piece, because I like Schubert for the record, but when I got on the air, I said, folks, forgive me for a second, but for those of you who know music theory, for those of you who don't, just bear with me for like 30 seconds for this. And I said, when he goes into that flat six, it's just so amazing. It's just one of the most gorgeous moments. And I was like, okay, I'm done now. Like, so I sort of, I own it. It was during the request show, because then somebody called in and said, I don't have a clue what you're talking about, but I know it meant a lot to you, and it's okay that it was technical, because in that moment it was like you needed to explain it in that way. And so like I realized that in the context of a printed program note, like my charming personality may not come across that way then, but that was one moment I can think of where I kind of got away with being technical, because I was able to contextualize it in the love of that particular moment. But I write program notes too in the summer, and this is something I struggle with as well. And I don't know, sometimes I just say, okay, 3 of the 5 paragraphs are going to be general reader, and 2 of the 5 I'm going to get a little more technical, with the hope that, if I alternate, maybe people will pick what they can understand from it, and just try not to be pedantic about it. But it's tricky. It's a tricky balance.
So I am a bad musicologist, and I can't cite a source right now, but I remember reading a study a couple of years ago that was a study about program notes, and basically it put program notes in front of an audience that was sort of the standard narrative program notes of, and then the oboe enters with this second theme. and the audience actually enjoyed the piece less in terms of how they ranked the piece. And you know, I can't speak to exactly why that is, but I really try to. I don't think there's necessarily a need to go into. I think exactly what you're saying is great. You know, have the part where you kind of nerd out. But I usually think it's detrimental to go into too much detail in program notes, because then it just becomes sort of a follow-along, you know, colored book thing. The other thing I was going to say about, and I actually forgot to say this when Jacques asked a question to start off, but my personal code with program notes is that I only write them for the entire concert. I refuse to write program notes for individual pieces. And so I only will address the narrative flow of the concert, and I use museum studies to talk about that, how, you know, any trip through a museum is this sort of narrative that's different from if the art were arranged in a different order, and I say that about the pieces. So any concert is unique. The only reason I know most of the time to go to a concert versus just listen to recordings is to experience this unique arrangement of pieces. And so that's how I work. And it actually has been wonderful for me personally, because it's forced me to draw connections between really disparate pieces of music. And sometimes the conductor will send me a letter afterwards and say, "Well, I had no idea. I never thought about any of these things, but you know, it made sense to them after that." But yeah, that's my feedback on that. Is that I mean, that would be my one bit of advice for notes that seems to work.
I was just going to say that I'm not talking about written program notes because I haven't written program notes myself, but in my lecturing, I often just budget in the time to explain a concept in a succinct way if I can, and just, you kind of have to pick and choose the things that are really going to be important to express so that the group can understand where you're going with it. And I really try and come up with metaphors and visual things to convey a very complex topic in the most pointed way. So one that jumps to mind is in Opera in the New Millennium, I had 7 minutes to talk about the history of music from about 1890 to present day, trying to explain how we got to the musical language that we now have in contemporary music. And part of that was explaining tonality, atonality. And so I came up with the idea that imagine that tonality is like a balloon, and the air that you're blowing in are chromatic notes. And eventually, if you blow in too many, the balloon is going to pop, right? That's what harmony is like, right? If you blow in too many chromatic notes, then the whole structure holding it together will just explode and collapse. And, you know, it's not a perfect metaphor, but it was enough to get people to say, oh, okay, I think I know what she means. And then you play some examples to illustrate your point. So, to how reductionist do you get? Part of it is knowing your audience, and part of it is if you have the opportunity to layer knowledge over several weeks, then that's like a nice luxury that you have. But I don't apologize for explaining the terminology. I'll just say, for those of you who don't know, we're going to learn this concept. For those of you who do, review never hurts, right? And we go from there.
Okay, well, thank you for sticking with us on the first night. Gold star to everybody. Thanks to all of you for attending. We're going to wrap up the formal part now, but if you have additional questions, please come talk with us now or throughout the conference. So thank you very much for coming.
I'm good. I'm just going to stop this, so just give me a moment. Finish.